My name's John Alexander. I'm a fellow of the Young Foundation, and I run an organisation called the New Citizenship Project. If you want to check out my work, then you're more than welcome to. But this evening really isn't about me. I'm just your host, and the reason I introduce myself is more to be clear that the Young Foundation takes no responsibility for me. So if I do or say anything wrong this evening, then it's my fault entirely, and don't blame them. I wanted to, but also before we go any further, acknowledge the context of this conversation in terms of public safety in the UK at the moment, and especially kind of given my sort of personal privilege as a white man in where things are at right now. This conversation isn't intended to be a political one. It's intended to be one that's about like how we can identify the positive potential of a conversation about community in relation to safety, and that feels like an important conversation to make space for. So, but I just want to acknowledge the moment in time that we're living in as one where it's both particularly sensitive and particularly important. So why am I hosting this? So this event came about actually through two things that happened last summer. The first was a friend of mine introduced me to Zach Norris and to his work, and then to Zach himself. Zach, who's the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in Oakland, California, is also the co-founder of Restore Oakland and of the campaign Justice for Families. And his book, We Keep Us Safe, is in a line setting out a new care-based model of safety that can replace deprivation, suspicion, punishment and isolation with resources, relationships, accountability and participation. What taken together he calls a culture of care. And the book is here. I will say a word more about the book at the end, but it's truly a remarkable read and really changed the way I think about safety in society. But so We Keep Us Safe, building secure, inclusive and just communities. And I came across this almost at exactly the same time as the Young Foundation, having established the Institute for Community Studies, then published Safety in Numbers, a report called Safety in Numbers, as one of its sort of first outputs, which identified safety as the single biggest issue across sort of building and understanding the priorities for people in communities across the country, as Emily will say a bit more about, as the modus operandi of the ICS. Finding safety was the single biggest issue. And I was so struck by the kind of core question in that Safety in Numbers report, which I'm sure we'll post a link to in the chat. The verbatim quote from one of the participants in the research, which was, "Can I look to others?" And so this notion of this collision of these two sort of deep understandings of the idea of community and safety coming together, and frankly, I was deeply excited by this and wanted to bring the conversation together, and so I contacted the Young Foundation and said, can we try and do something? And so that is the spirit of the conversation this evening, a really genuine exploration and inquiry into what is the relationship between community and safety. What's the potential of these community-led approaches to building public safety? And so in that spirit, this is a session, and the reason it's a meeting rather than a webinar is because we're genuinely very keen to kind of build the understanding across the group and hear from you as well, not just treat you as an audience. So the structure of the session will be that Zach, Emily Morrison, who's the head of the Institute for Community Studies, and Donna Hall, who's the chair of New Local, the think tank New Local, and former chief executive of Wigan Council, and one of the leading voices of the community power movement as it's becoming known in the UK. We'll play a bit of a role as sort of conversation starters as we flow through a rough flow of conversation. But really, this is an invite to you all to chip in and share your experiences and ideas and thoughts as well. So the rough ground rules I've sometimes used for these sorts of conversations are, firstly, and these are very rough ground rules. Firstly, kind of we sometimes say no questions, like you are allowed to ask questions, but the primary invitation is to share your own, add your own wisdom to the pool. We talk about passing the mic, so making sure that as many voices can be heard in a meeting like this as possible, and basically be kind, which I'm sure will come easily to anyone who's on the Young Foundation's lists. So in that spirit, as we go through, please do post in the chat, share your ideas, share links, raise your hand, use the raise your hand function in the participants box. Hopefully you've had enough Zoom experience over the last 18 months to find that, but do ping a message to admin if you can't, and we'll try and help you. We might not come to everyone, but between myself and we have Sarah and Jess in looking at tracking the chat and the participants as well. We'll try and involve as much as we can. So the flow of the conversation, we're going to run through kind of why is it important to talk about safety in community now, particularly. We're going to think about practical examples and inspirations, and we're going to then think about where the conversation might go next. So without further ado, I'm going to turn first with that conversation, with that question of like, why is it so important to talk about community and safety together, particularly in this moment in time. I'm going to ask Emily to say a word, to share a bit more about the Institute for Community Studies and that safety in numbers research, and open the conversation from there. And Emily, I think we were also hoping to be joined by Tom McNeil this evening, but he's slightly unable to make it. And Emily, you were going to say a word about Tom as well.
Yes, thanks so much, John. And can I also extend a very warm welcome to everybody on behalf of the Institute for Community Studies and the Young Foundation. And we are thrilled that Zach Norris has come to share with us the insights from his book, which is a brilliant read. And I would really encourage anyone who hasn't already read it to make sure that they do go and grab a copy afterwards. But at the Institute for Community Studies, our core focus has been to try to flip who sets the agenda in terms of the issues that are researched and that are acted upon, and that we advocate for policymakers to take an interest in and change. And part of that has been to do a co-governance model where communities are an active part of setting our own strategy, and we have a community advisory board who do just that from across all walks of life in the UK, and we're very lucky to have that. And Tom McNeil, who you mentioned, John, is one of those members and is part of the police commissioners team in the West Midlands, but sadly has had to apologise for not being there because he is dealing with some live issues on community safety in the West Midlands at the moment. So he sends his apologies, but he was hoping to be here as well. And hopefully some of what I will pass on from him is not too poor a substitute as well from what he would have said. But just to reflect on safety in numbers, which really was the catalyst for us acting on this issue from communities, which was that when we conducted our research, we engaged with over 3,000 people from across the UK through a variety of different approaches, most of which were more what we call deep ethnographic and participatory action research approaches. And really what we found was that over a fifth of the conversations and the responses and the interviews that we undertook highlighted questions to do with safety as the most important priority for communities. And just to share a little bit of what that reflected and the kind of things that those questions were about, people talked about the anxiety and insecurity they felt through the increased sense of isolation they felt from different members of communities and from people who they felt they were not like, and who they weren't sure that they could turn to in their local neighbourhoods. And this was both in reflection of authorities, but also in terms of feeling that there were deep divides between different community groups at local level, but also deep divides within society, and a sense that rising inequalities and rising poverty over the last 10 years in the UK had really started to take effect in terms of how people were feeling in terms of the injustice that they saw day to day in society. Their questions reflected very powerful lived experiences of discrimination and marginalisation on account of race, but also on account of gender. And these are, of course, very live issues that we've seen over the last year and really put this conversation into very stark effect. And what people were really asking and questioning was, why are there no new solutions to dealing with these long-standing issues? These weren't, after all, issues that people hadn't encountered before, but people were becoming tired of seeing a lack of response to some of the issues to do with gender-based violence, but also to do with discrimination against racialized minorities that they saw in communities around them. It was also reflected an awareness of how people felt they were having to go it alone in terms of the disappearing presence at the time from policing and authorities in the UK, largely due to cuts due to austerity, and people raising that though they very much wanted to do more, they were worried about shouldering the whole burden alone in communities, and about the responsibility for keeping us safe falling to communities on their own rather than it being a shared effort. And so these themes and issues that people were raising with us over the course of forming Safety in Numbers, our agenda, and I see someone's helpfully put the link there in case anyone wants to go and read further about it, really started to shape about sort of 6 or 7 core questions that we've then taken forward into some of our further research and work with different local groups about safety. And I just wanted to share one of the most powerful ones, which I think really links to Zach's book, and hopefully Zach can shed much more powerful insight on this and much more real insight on this than I can as a researcher, which is people agreed that one of the questions should be, what determines whether a community comes together to act on an issue which affects their collective safety? And I think this is a really important one, and a really good reason for why we're talking about this today, because we are seeing all around us, particularly over the last few weeks in the UK, with the response to, for example, the Sarah Everard murder, but also to the murders of many other women that have really been coming to light, and rightly, across the UK, that people really want to act, and they want to act in solidarity, and they want to act with others, and they also want to see change happen, and fast. But we need to understand, how that can happen in a way that, as I said, puts it as a shared responsibility with all those that are affected. And we need to understand what determines whether and how, communities will come together, and on what issues, so that, it can be a collective effort, and one that is inclusive as well. So I won't take up any more of your time on this question. I'm really longing to hear from the other panelists, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a bit about our report as well.
Thanks so much, Emily. That's a wonderful setup. I'm just going to repeat that question. I think I've got it right. I've posted it in the chat as well. But what determines whether a community comes together to act on an issue that affects their collective safety? I think that's a really powerful frame. Zach, I'm going to come to you. Would you like to, this question of why is it important to talk about safety and community together, and to do so right now? But please tell us a bit more about the ideas in the book, and lead us into your work. You're on mute, my friend.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you all. I find myself in East Oakland, California. Oakland is a very diverse city within a very diverse state of California. The Bay Area is known as a kind of liberal place. And yet the issues that I'm going to talk about are just as present here as across the United States. And I think that there is just some kismet happening here, because when I thought about titles for the book, Safety in Numbers was one of the titles that also came up. And we decided to use We Keep Us Safe initially because of the sort of social movements that were burgeoning and building up to call for solutions that weren't based on the same ideologies of punishment, isolation, deprivation, suspicion that you named, John, and that I name in the book as part of this framework of fear. And another sort of similarity or connection is that the book really comes out of community-driven research. So prior to writing the book, the organization where I work, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, which is based here in Oakland, we worked with 20 other community-based organizations across the country and surveyed over 1,000 folks. These are formerly incarcerated people, family members of formerly or currently incarcerated people, survivors of crime, who were really calling for a different paradigm as it relates to how we keep us safe. And here in the United States, this issue of anxiety was also very much present, right? And interestingly, prior to COVID, and still by and large true, our crime rates were actually at historical lows, but our anxiety rates were at historical highs. right? And it shows that there is this distinction between what gets addressed as a crime and this broader suite of things that are harms in our society, from inequality to climate change to public health issues like COVID-19. And what we've seen here in the United States is we have gone way off the deep end in terms of adopting a fear-based mindset when it comes to safety. And that is reflected in a few very stark statistics. One is that we have 4% of the world's population roughly, and about a quarter of the world's incarcerated people. We have also produced some 25% of the world's carbon emissions. And so there's this reality where if you haven't taken care of people and the planet, you aren't really taking care of public safety. Or as I say it, if you aren't taking care of the public, you aren't taking care of public safety. And so when something like COVID-19 comes along, you are going to be exposed for your lack of public health infrastructure. So we have always said, drug use and abuse, mental health issues, homelessness, even violence, these are things that can be treated as public health issues rather than just adopting a sort of criminalization approach. We never thought we would need to say a global pandemic should be treated as a public health issue, but you saw here in the United States that same gut reaction that had been playing out so many times year after year, to rather than getting to the root of the issue, using this kind of blame and shame kind of dynamic. The president calling it China flu and using opportunities that what the folks that I call in the book the architects of anxiety always do. They point to the sort of so-called bad guy rather than recognizing that most harm that happens is actually people we know very intimately. And so things like gender-based violence don't go addressed inside of the United States in ways they should, because we have this framework of fear that is actually more often than not reinforcing racialized stereotypes, as well as not addressing some of the underlying issues of gender-based violence, which really stem from patriarchy as well. And so what we and I am calling for in this book is a shift away from this framework of fear towards a culture of care that is really grounded in relationship, participation, accountability, and resources. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but I'll pause for that for now.
I saw Catherine waving at me frantically, so thank you, Catherine. That's the first vital audience meeting participation of the event. I have unmuted myself. So Donna, I wonder if you would like to share any reflections. I think we're going to try and move into a bit more of the, as Zach was sort of leading us into the conversation about like what does this look like on the ground. But Donna, I'd love to your reflection and your experience as a chief executive and and through New Local as well. Like this question of why is it important to have this kind of conversation now?
Well, thanks for the invite, John. I think it's a fantastic event, and I've not read your book, Zach, but I'm going to get one tonight. I'm going to order one, and I can't wait to read it. It sounds like we're very aligned in our thinking. So I really liked it when you said we need a paradigm shift in the way we work together, and I really believe in that as well. We've created something called the community paradigm, which is a piece of work we did about 2 years ago through New Local, and it's been really kind of gaining in traction over the last 2 years. And we've got lots of people on both sides, unusually both sides of the political fence have kind of embraced it. So at the Conservative Party conference, was it last week or the week before, they were kind of holding it up as being an example of the way that they need to shift their policy, which we were quite surprised at, I'll be honest. And we've also got great traction with members of the Labour Party and the Shadow Cabinet who really want to shift public policy making towards a more preventative societal response, rather than what we've got at the moment, which is a very siloed, divided, transactional based, separate, government departmental, unbelievably incoherent patchwork quilt of projects and initiatives, pilots and pathfinders. There've been 400 in the last 2 years, 400 new pots of money to apply for localities to go through a kind of beauty contest to judge who's going to have the best community safety project, who's going to get funded for a 3-year fixed term project. And then when the money runs out, just completely move out of the area and disappear. So that is not the way to build trust in local communities. And what we're arguing for is a radical shift of power to local people. You know, since Trump, since Brexit, all of the kind of divisive policies that have kind of internationally spread around a nationalist way of bringing together people's philosophy and belief systems around nation rather than around class and connection. And that's the kind of thing that I think we need to move away from. You know, we've never been as divided as we are in this country or in the world at the moment. You know, the hatred that was whipped up as part of the Brexit referendum against immigrants, you know, those posters that said, you know, a huge waiting queue of people coming over from Turkey, and it was just horrific. It was designed to whip up hatred of immigrants. And the situation we're now in is, you know, you've got people desperately clinging to that philosophy when they've actually got more in common with the people standing in those queues than they have with the ruling class of people. Sorry, I sound very political. I'm not normally political, but this is a real political time, I think, for people, and people are very angry in this country. And I think really, you know, the inequalities that we face, the health inequalities. I chair a hospital in Bolton, and you know that the disparities in healthy life expectancies in our poorest areas and where our Black and minority ethnic communities live is just unforgivable. It doesn't matter how good we are as a hospital if people are dying 20 years before they should be dying. You know, we've got to shift power, we've got to shift control, we've got to design services with people, with local people, we've got to wrap support and services around people proactively, preventatively. I'm not sure if colleagues have listened to Professor Michael Marmot from University of Central London, but his work points to the fact that for the first time since the creation of the welfare state and the creation of the NHS, healthy life expectancy is not only stalling but going backwards. So people are dying sooner. It's okay, John. People are dying sooner than they should be. So no, I love your work, Zach. I love what you stand for in the Young Foundation, and yeah, anything I can do to help.
It's a lovely, I think, a very powerful place. Sorry, Donna, I thought you'd paused. But this idea that we may not in the UK have 4% of the global population and 25% of the incarcerated population, but we certainly have some of the same tendencies, some of the same things manifesting in our society at the moment. But we want to turn the conversation to sort of, so what's happening on this? What are the things? What are the stories that we can learn from? What does this agenda actually look like in positive practice? And we're going to come to you, Zach, first to share with us a bit of inspiration. What are a couple of your favourites that you'd love us to know about? Can we unmute? There he is. Oh, no.
Apologies, I was not at first able to unmute myself. So yeah, really happy to talk about solutions. And thank you, Donna, for that offer. I definitely would love to stay in contact and continue to building collaboratively. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is I am standing in what we call a new solar panel of community safety. And let me explain what I mean by that. So in the environmental context, we believe it's been helpful to be able to see solar panels and wind turbines and permaculture and different examples of what a new energy infrastructure should look like. Similarly, we believe that people need to be able to see what new community safety infrastructure looks like. And so what we did was design a building based on some of that research that I described in the Who Pays report. So that report got covered by CNN and Washington Post and New York Times, but the coverage was all about the cost of incarceration rather than the solutions that families were really calling for. And people were saying, similar to what you're saying, Donna, like, I rode my bike to work this morning and you see so many folks without homes along the way, burned down buildings, like infrastructure crumbling, riding past schools that are underfunded and under-resourced. And so part of what we decided to try to do is encapsulate our vision of community safety in this building. This building is called Restore Oakland. It's an 18,000 square foot building. It houses a dedicated space for restorative justice, which I'll come back to, a restaurant space that is serving people in the community. We do mutual aid where we bring people to pass out masks, to pass out food. We're also doing advocacy work to help people keep their homes, to stay in their homes. And we have been, continuing to do advocacy to move resources towards public health responses to public health issues, as I've talked about. And so this space is really unique. It's one of the only spaces across the country that has a dedicated space for restorative justice. And what that means is a different form of addressing harm. So rather than the person who's caused harm, the person who's been harmed, sitting in a courtroom where they sit on opposite sides of the courtroom, a judge deliberates on what happens and then hands out a long sentence, typically here in the United States, of prison. This process is really different. It is the person who's caused harm, the person who's been harmed, surrounded by people that care about them. An accountability plan is developed. That person must acknowledge the harm that they have caused, and that they must then follow through on consequences of their actions to make amends. And what we've seen is that this really works. It works for the person who's caused harm. People are much less likely to recidivate or get back in trouble with the law again when they've gone through a restorative justice process. Victims report much higher satisfaction rates with restorative justice. And guess what? Everyone around that circle, who's sitting in that circle, is asking themselves, what could I have done to prevent this harm from happening? And thinking broadly about that, right? And so that kind of community orientation to safety, I think, is indicative of what we're talking about in terms of safety in numbers. People are really asking themselves, when I see someone who looks quote unquote suspicious in my neighborhood, what is my response? How am I addressing some of the issues that I see on a daily basis? And I think that muscle of showing each other how we really enact accountability is not just important, for the person on the corner block, but also for the person in the corner office, right? Not just the person on the street, but also in the suites of power. And when we build that muscle of accountability, we can then start to translate that into different spheres that I think will be helpful, not just in terms of safety, but quite frankly, in terms of the strength of our democracy.
Such a lovely example, and it makes me think, just come across the idea of a sort of physical space that embodies this different approach. I think is a really powerful one. I just came across today, people, and do share stuff in the chat. I've just seen something from Neil. Actually, Neil, do you want to pipe up and share? What are you saying? You're talking a bit more about the relationships project. Would you like to share something into the space?
Yes, sorry, multiple mutes and microphones in the wrong place. Only 18 months, you'd think he'd learn. Yeah, I thought this was wonderful. Zach, Architects of Anxiety within a Framework of Fear, was it? Just so descriptive. And when I look at the UK government's response centrally in terms of their community responses about COVID, it feels like that's where we've gone. And I worry that we've started this pandemic in a fractured and divided way in many places, that to keep each other safe, we have been apart. And therefore, although we've seen some strength and reciprocity between communities like us, the connections between communities not like us have fallen away. And we've started to express ourselves in the language of anger, judgment, and blame. So for us, if we're going to be back on a road to recovery, we need to look at recovery in terms of a community sense. And we've been trying with the Relationships Project, I've dropped it in the chat, to say, how can we help communities do a step-by-step guide to building bridges in their communities and thinking like a mediator. We think this is more important now than ever. We know from the research that how people recover from disaster relates to how closely they're connected and how much trust they have in other groups, including the government. But if we're going to talk about things like safety, and it's a really interesting question, Emily, because I'm a community mediator, and there are unlocking points about a community coming together around their collective security that don't lead to great outcomes, shall we say, and are driven on that sort of script of fear. And I think safety is particularly important because we ask ourselves either or questions. So that's like, for old people to be safe, we need to kick the young people out of the park. And really, I think the key to this is coming together and thinking and both questions. So how can we make this space accessible and safe for everybody? And how do we explain what the benefits of this space are? I'll shut up now. I've had too much coffee.
Thank you, Neil. Would you just say one more quick word about who we are, and just so we can situate where you're coming from in that conversation?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that wouldn't have been helpful, wouldn't it? So I'm Neil. I'm an independent community mediator that has experience of working between lots of different communities in lots of different places, either experiencing destructive conflict or I try and work with them to solve real life problems in ways that strengthen human relationships. I've done that quite a lot with communities experiencing disaster. So that's why I'm one of the professors in practice at the After Disasters Network in the Institute of Hazard, Risk and Resilience at Durham Uni. And I've been working with my awesome colleagues in the Relationships Project that have taken my garbled mess of a brain and turned it into a step-by-step guide.
Lovely stuff. And the link to that step-by-step guide, if people want it, is as I've seen in the chat. Thank you very much, Neil. I'm just going to add, I came across today where I happen to be at a big conference today, and I've just been told about the city of Bogota is working with the former chief creative officer of Mexico City. I mean, how wonderful a sentence that, before I even get to the point, on the question of what it would look like to put the idea of care at the heart of a city. And so I've just posted a link to the
John,
chat, link in the chat. I won't say. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was going to ask after you're finished if I might just respond briefly to Neil's comment. Great.
Please.
I appreciate it. It reminded me of Richmond, California. So in the book, I talk about Richmond. Richmond is a city that drew a large population of African Americans during World War II, and then really kicked those folks to the curb after the wartime industries kind of went bust. And that resulted in decades of deprivation and isolation of African American communities. And in the early 2000s, Richmond had one of the highest per capita murder rates in the entire country. The city was up in arms about what to do. Devone Bogan, who's from Michigan, but was working in Oakland, suggested that they do a mentorship program for these young men who the police believe were responsible for 70% of the homicides. And it just reminded me of, your park analogy, where people were literally afraid to go to parks in Richmond. They were afraid to keep their shops open. And it was a whole city problem, right? Devone said, I want to develop a program that is based in the same around what my own adolescent kids needs. And he said, I want to provide mentorship for these young people, put some money in their pocket so they can support their families, and give them travel opportunities to actually expand their horizons. And it got a lot of pushback because it's like, well, why are you giving these opportunities, resourcing people who are accused of shooting one another? But over an 8-year period, people could not argue with the results. It resulted in a drastic reduction in homicide, which had that kind of larger community benefit where people could now take their kids to the park, and shopkeepers were keeping their stores open longer. And I think is a real example of this shift from a sort of just framework of fear to a culture of care, and what that can mean in terms of the building of relationship. And the last thing I'll say is, like, the first thing he did was say to these young men, everyone has looked at you as the problem. I want to talk with you about what you think the solutions are. And so it was this fundamental shift in terms of relationship to these young men that helped open this new possibility in terms of safety and just prosperity in the city of Richmond.
Thank you so much, Zach. I was hoping you might mention Devone, that I've never heard you put it like that before. Emily, I'm going to come to you if I may, and like share some of your reflections and some of your favourites, if you would.
And thanks, John. And actually, what Zach was saying, and also the previous contributor, was basically reminding me of an initiative that I worked on in a previous role, actually, also in Colombia. It was interesting that it was that you mentioned Bogota, but in the city of Medellin, where they were working on what they called the Parques Educatives, which was in response to obviously the still present, sort of very difficult conflict context within Medellin. And the mayor at the time then decided that rather than there being no-go areas, that certain parts of the community felt alienated from, that they were going to, rather than kind of put in place more, sort of patrols or an increased army presence or things like that, they were actually going to put more resources into these parks. So they were actual physical public spaces in the public realm within the city, and they were going to put in place education resources, library within the parks. They were going to put gyms and a basketball court and other different resources that were going to encourage both all across the generations and families to all use the park together. And they were putting in place deliberately more resources, more care, and I love Zach's framework of care, for populations who were experiencing, conflict, but also who felt that there were parts of the city that just did not belong to them, partly, through their relationship with risk, but also partly their relationship, with the history of those places. And it was a wonderful initiative, and I think it really demonstrates that not only created kind of resources, it also created connectivity between people, because people met other people. They broke down barriers to actually engaging with other people, but not necessarily through a kind of forced approach, through an approach that was also about contributing to their day-to-day everyday lives in a positive sense. And I just wanted to highlight one of the things that I was thinking about when Zach was speaking was that a lot of the issues around safety that we heard in the agenda really came down to that there is a severe deprivation of trust now in the UK. We have a deprivation of trust in authorities, and that is because we've also had a taught deprivation of accountability in some ways, which is, over the course of it, we've almost been encouraged to think that there will be less resources, there will be less welfare, there will be less care. And, it is quite interesting how the research that we did sort of told us what the possible, sort of offshoot is that, if you are receiving less care, and you feel you are less able to count on those that have supported you in the past, whether that's, at local or national or even at community level, you then perhaps then take that behavior into how you respond to others. So it becomes almost like a vicious cycle, basically. So there's so much in what Zach's saying about how we bring more care and more trust, into these activities in order to engender a better sense of community safety. So.
That's very powerful. That phrase, a taught deprivation of accountability, is going to, I might wake up in the middle of the night thinking of that. But Emily, I wonder if I can press you to carry on a little bit and maybe channel your Tom McNeill, if you would. And what are there things that you think Tom would have wanted to sort of bring to this?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak to everything that Tom is doing, and I'm sure we can circulate more information, but initiatives that they've been working on particularly relate to working directly with organisations and through organisations who have worked with young people who've fallen through different parts of, sort of the education care system, or indeed those who have been, in prison as or incarcerated, as Zach was talking about. And what they have really focused on is, sort of working with them, particularly on similar programs such as in a mentoring capacity, but also trying to solve some of the conditions that lead to people's insecurity, which then perhaps perpetuate difficult pathways into crime or into, drug abuse or into, sort of negative kind of livelihoods, basically, which is, they've looked at working through the whole community ecosystem. So seeing safety as something that requires secure housing, for example, that requires, a secure sense of employment that requires, you know, access to skills and leisure facilities, that requires young people to have a sense of purpose, and for that purpose to, you know, come with a sense of hope. And also mentoring and indeed counselling for mental health issues that they might have, or through to help them through trauma that might have led to why they are, you know, committing crime, basically. And what I loved about that is that kind of whole community approach to looking after a young person, and working through networks of frontline organisations, and recognising that all of these frontline organisations are part of the solution. So it shouldn't just be the police leading that, it should be, you know, everyone's responsibility, and that there should be resources distributed to support it being everyone's responsibility. So again, you know, Tom might have said something very, very different, but I know that's one of the examples that we were talking about before, and one that I think it might be useful to share here.
Great, thank you, Emily. I've clocked you and Neil in your hand up. I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but I just, while we're on this subject, I wondered, I've spotted an old contact, Kevin Ditcham, in the meeting, and I wondered if, and I know, Kevin, you've been building a team, I think, of public engagement at Police Scotland. Is that right? So I wondered if you might share some reflections on the conversation so far, and anything that you're kind of particularly interested and excited about. I'd love to hear from you if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'm just a bit kind of astounded by everything that's been shared so far. I think I've had a few light bulb moments. So I'm in a bit of a small team within our strategy and innovation service within Police Scotland, and really what we're trying to do is shape a bit of what everyone's talking about, really, which is difficult. We're trying to do it in an area in the north, so around, if anyone's been to John O'Groats before or heard about that area in Caithness. So it's a geographic area that has complex issues, not among the people who live there, but complex issues in terms of mass unemployment, service delivery. It's very remote and rural. People they've got a population that's moving down towards Central Belt and further south. No one wants to live or work there. So in terms of public service delivery and supporting communities to start to think about or facilitate these conversations, it's actually really, really difficult to build that trust in communities because they've been let down so many times. So what I'm trying to think about is how we do that a little bit differently and bring communities alongside from the very start. I'm a community worker, community education by training, and I've done lots of work in kind of participation and democracy. So I'm trying to do this in a large, complex organisation in the justice sector that's bringing new thought and new perspectives. I think the other thing I would say is that in Scotland we have it's not brilliant, but a good legal framework around community empowerment, although I don't agree with that term. I don't think it's anyone's role to empower communities. Communities already hold power. But around community empowerment and what we can do. So I guess in that note, we should all be aspiring to work towards what's called Scotland's National Performance Framework. And one of the national outcomes for the country is around we grow up loved, safe and respected. So what our team is trying to do is reframe some of the conversations around justice, around something that, apologies, I've forgotten who mentioned it, around a caring, compassionate response and what that means. So sorry, I feel like I'm kind of waffling now, but I think essentially I've only been in post since February, so this is all very new. We're on a bit of a journey, and we're trying to grow something that's not been done before in Police Scotland anyway, and maybe perhaps in a policing organisation in the UK. So I guess I'm happy to connect and happy to share thought and insight with others. So please help.
Thank you. No, and that I didn't know those outcomes. Would you just repeat the language of that outcome, the national plan outcome?
Yeah. So if anyone's interested, it's on. I'll share a link in the chat. Actually, it's Scotland's National Performance Framework. So it's I guess the overarching framework of all public service and community kind of outcomes in Scotland, and there's many outcomes that relate to policing or justice or community safety, but the main one is around we grow up loved, safe and respected. So it relates lots to children, but also the wider sense of what does it mean to be loved, safe and respected? I remember it was launched a few years ago and there was a lot of controversy that a government document had the word loved in it, or love, and what does that actually mean? But government were really kind of strong on using that word.
Thank you for that. Neil, did you want to come in?
Yeah, that resonates with me so strongly, Kevin. And I think it's important that we understand that communities that don't feel heard will shout, and that communities that have repeatedly had their unmet needs ignored will express that in the language of judgment and anger and blame. And I worry that we're losing something in terms of state agencies and communities, that we respond to that anger and judgment and blame with anger and judgment and exclusion. And I think we need to listen with real empathy and compassion to these voices that may sound judgy and blamey, but actually are expressions of unmet need. But what I put my hand up because it struck me. Johan Galtung says that peace is more than the absence of violence. And we always look in our scarcity model to the police as if they're the front line in our journey towards safety. And I would argue that in a successful society, the police would be the back line in this work. And if I come on lots of these kind of conversations, and this one is obviously about safety. I've been on ones around counter-extremism, gangs, drugs, poverty, hatred, etc. And I wonder if these are all siloed problems to a disconnected society. And actually the common solution could actually span a lot of the things that at the moment we're segregating up, when I think if we put that connectivity and trust in where we are with the people like us and with the people not like us, and we then created a much more open and trusting relationship vertically with state and those that can provide additional resources, then if that actually wouldn't solve all of these individual silos that I think are false.
Thanks for that, Neil. Zach, I wonder if Donna, I'm going to bring you back in a moment if I may, but Zach, before we do that, I'd love, like, this is really hard work, right? Like, I mean, some of this can sound like we're talking about like nice things to do or lovely projects, but this is difficult stuff. I mean, I'd love your reflections on some of what you've heard, some of what you're thinking, like, and what the reality of doing this work really is, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think the reality of the work and what it looks like in our context is using various tools, from organizing to policy advocacy to communications, to really lift up the kind of paradigm shift that we need, and also to hold leaders accountable to this vision of public health safety, of this vision of public safety really starting with public health and starting with this kind of culture of care. Because, you know, in my context, I grew up in East Oakland, but I went to Harvard University as an undergrad, and I saw, you know, public health solutions for public health issues when students at Harvard were using and abusing drugs, when they were getting in fights. It was always clear that they were more than their worst mistake, that they were more than the worst thing that they've ever done, as one of my mentors, Brian Stevenson, says. And so that reality, that approach to supporting someone who's going through a difficult situation shouldn't be determined by what school you're at or what zip code or city or town you're from. And that is something that I think we have used all the means. So we every year are moving bills inside of California legislature. We are advocating for a shift of resources. Just a couple of years ago, we won every year since 2015, 2016, $10 million away from the sheriff and probation department that had been basically replicating the mistakes of the state government in warehousing people in prisons rather than actually getting to some of the root issues. And so we were successful in moving our local municipality to move some of those resources towards a more public health approach. So our work, you know, it looks like a lot of different public events, but also some of the behind the scenes, like getting into the weeds of city and county budgets and legislative initiatives as well.
I just want to press you a little on this. And I don't want to get too caught in the weeds of this if it's not a helpful place to be. So people flag, but the frame of you just talked about transferring budgets, and the frame of defund the police is obviously a very sort of has been a very, I don't know what language to use, a language that's attracted attention and not always in good ways. And Donna was talking about the power of the kind of community paradigm approach as something that seems to be getting traction on both sides of the aisle, yet at the same time the kind of the sort of tough on crime rhetoric and the greater investment in policing as the solution seems to still be part of our conversation, even as this sort of community power thing grows. I just wonder if you have any reflections on the framing of this shift of budgets and that kind of thing that you could share with us.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I think, look, the organizers and activists and community members, and I include myself among those folks who have been saying we need to defund the police and we need to refund communities, are doing so not out of a lack of experience, right? And so the solutions that have traditionally been proposed when it comes to state violence, from body cameras to different levels of training, have not actually worked inside the United States in terms of moving the needle on these issues. And I think what Neil was saying in terms of like there being a front line that actually looks like public health and community oriented responses has totally been eviscerated. And so we can talk about the police being the back line, but we actually need the front line. And so I think that the clarity of the call for defunding the police is oriented around really bringing that to folks' attention. It has been very politicized. And I think my hope would be that some of the folks who both police officers as well as politicians would, rather than just saying, this is like Barack Obama unfortunately said, defund the police is a snappy slogan, but what's the there behind it kind of thing. And so I was on the radio in Chicago, where he's very much beloved, trying to, say, what if Barack Obama had, instead of saying that, said, something more along the lines of what Neil said, is like, look, people are shouting for to be heard and to make sure that people understand that we haven't actually resourced the kind of community-oriented responses. And so I think that there is a need to actually shift resources in these ways. And I could go through just the statistics, but we spend 53 cents of every discretionary federal dollar on the military. From 1980 to 2000, basically to now, in California, we built 23 new prisons and just one new university. Near 300% increase in spending for police across the board, including in liberal states like California, in municipalities like Alameda County and in cities like Oakland. So the numbers are really there. And so when people are saying we need this resource shift, it's not out of, just sort of Pollyannish desire. It's really a felt understanding of a lack of care that then translates to police responses to these issues. So if you look at what the Oakland Police Department are responding to in Oakland, they're responding to mental health disturbances. They're responding to disturbances in homes. They're responding to school discipline issues. They're responding to a whole host of things that you don't want someone who's armed with a gun responding to someone who's suicidal. It just doesn't make sense. And so I think that there's, I think that there's room for us to have those difficult conversations, and hopefully in ways that aren't divisive, but also acknowledge the underlying reality.
Thank you, Zach, and I hope the question is suitably respectfully asked as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate it.
Emily, did you want to chip in?
I just really wanted to follow up with a question to Zach, more about kind of I'm really interested in how you describe the solar powered space that you have built. And I just wondered if you could talk about kind of how that idea, the importance of the space kind of came about. And because one of the things I was just reflecting on when we were talking was thinking back on the conversations we had about safety, you know, with people across the UK, and as well as you know, sort of a sense of wanting there to be a different way forward, there was also a real sense of uncertainty and feeling quite scared about what happened if, you know, sort of they saw sort of there to be less kind of law enforcement, or, you know, less sort of visible policing, as it were. I think, you know, obviously that is partly because that is what we have been used to in the past. But people also mentioned, you know, things that they would like to see returned were community safety officers or community support officers who were there more consistently and present in the community, having conversations, not just there when something went wrong, but there to actually discuss, you know, people's concerns and build relationships and build bridges, you know, on a day-to-day basis, not just to, you know, as you said, respond kind of to incidents. So I just wondered, you know, with the people who perhaps are feeling, you know, we see this as maybe kind of something to be worried about, you know, sort of, or possibly moving from, you know, having these more rigid structures, you know, so how have you sort of broached that and brought people to your space? I wondered if you would mind saying a bit about that, and I hope you don't mind me asking. So.
No, it's a really great question, and I appreciate it a lot. I think that Restore Oakland, this community initiative, this building was really built out of frustration, in addition to out of optimism. And what I mean by that is we were actually successful in, as I mentioned, redirecting some of our municipal resources towards a public health approach. But we saw that when those requests for proposals, or we call them RFPs, were issued, a lot of the same nonprofit providers who were very good at responding to an RFP, but not as good at actually responding to community, were getting some of those contracts. And so we wanted to build a sort of more community-centered initiative. And we're looking at, you know, you mentioned community guardians. We were looking at some of the work in New Zealand, where there have been you know, folks who are more tied to Aboriginal communities who are responding to different incidents and doing so in a much more kind of caring way and approach. And, you know, I think that there is this reality of like a racial divide. We see in places like Burlington, Vermont, the police chief leading a more public health response to drug use and abuse, right? Because they can see in the folks who are suffering from addiction to opiates, they can see themselves, they can see their cousins, and they're actually, the police chief in Burlington was actually counseling the hospital systems, like, no, I don't want to deal with it through this kind of criminal approach. I want you all to use a sort of detox approach. And so those are the kinds of things that I think should be present in every community. And part of what we were trying to build with Restore Oakland is just some visibility about we can deal with harm in a different way. So I hope that, you know, starts to answer some of your questions. Some of how we started to bring people together is by using restorative justice in both a formal way as well as an informal way. So if you're the district attorney, you can refer people to a restorative justice process. So if you're the sort of top cop in our municipality, is what the district attorney is, you can actually refer someone to a restorative justice process. So it does have a sort of systems approach. But also, if you're a mother who is experiencing domestic violence, you've seen the lack of a successful police response in terms of, you know, violence. You could actually try to bring your partner to Restore Oakland to deal with through restorative justice that issue as well. So it's both used for folks who, and there are many folks in Oakland who do not trust the police, who are not in a space of believing that calling the police will actually in any way help themselves or their family. And this is a place where people can come to actually respond in that scenario, but also we're trying to build out some of the systems approach and getting referrals. And so that's part of how we're trying to thread the needle in terms of bringing communities together.
Thank you so much, Zach. I mean, that was incredibly illuminating, and I love the positioning of the formal and the informal approach, and almost kind of you have to sort of work at it from the top down and the bottom up, basically. But then, you know, carving out that space that is, I suppose, in a way, gives you said visibility. I'm also thinking that kind of institutional permanence, or that thing that people can rely upon, they can return to it. It's a beacon. You know, I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, that idea of a kind of symbolic space of like the physicality of it feels like it's a really important intervention. Donna, I've seen Ben Collier chipping in the chat, and I know Ben has some really interesting experience in some slightly different aspects of this conversation. So I'll come to you in just a moment, Ben. But Donna, I've made you wait for a long time to share your reflections and some of your sort of favourites, but I'd love to bring you in at this point.
Yeah, thanks, John. No, it's been great just to listen to fantastic work. And can I just say, well done to Police Scotland. They're the only public service who've not told women how to keep themselves safe, and have actually told men to change their behaviour. Fantastic video that's out on Twitter. So well done, Kevin. And I love the Scottish Care Review and the Scottish Performance Framework talking about love. And I think one of the reasons it does talk about love, it was co-produced by people, care experienced young people, you know, and when you speak to people, they talk in language like that, love and care, you know, rather than transactional language that we use when we're trying to design systems and public services. So yeah, loads of examples of things that work really well. So I think the social contract is straining and broken, isn't it, at the moment, not just in the UK, but internationally, with the growth in nationalism and some of the things we've been talking about. So, you know, I think it's about how to restore that social contract. I completely agree with Neil. It's not about shifting power. Communities have power. It's about changing the way public services work with citizens in a different way. Zach calls it care. I call it strengths-based working. People use slightly different language, don't they, to mean the same thing. And I think this kind of idea of a social movement, international social movement around some of these principles is really badly needed. I also agree, I can't remember who said it now, that I think it was Neil, that it isn't just safety, it's everything. So it's children's social care, it's those principles that are in the Scottish performance framework around respect, around growing up loved. So it's children, it's adult social care, it's the whole society and how we live, it's housing, it's drug and alcohol services, it's neighbourliness. So what we did in Wigan was try to focus on that social contract, and that's, you know, over a long period of time. It wasn't a project, it was a long-term shift in the relationship between citizen and state, based on freezing council tax, investing in the community and voluntary sector, and training everybody in ethnographic techniques. So how to listen deeply rather than make snap judgments and put people into little boxes. Every public servant working in the place went on that asset-based training, and they stuck with it. So it wasn't a project, it was just the way we did things every day, 365 days a year. We used an anthropologist to help us design it, and it was based across public services, partnership with the police, criminal justice, Department of Work and Pensions, housing, the NHS, GPs, schools. Everybody was part of it, and it was a whole place-based endeavour. So yeah, just one example.
And that work in Wigan is truly inspiring, continues to be some of the most inspiring work anywhere in the country. Thank you, Donna. Ben, can I come to you and see where you'd like to take the conversation, and whether you'd like to sort of send us somewhere else or add something?
I think I'd like to, I'm enjoying so much where the conversation is that I think I'd very much like to keep it in roughly the same place, but possibly add a little bit if possible. So hi, I'm Ben. I'm from the University of Edinburgh. John very kindly reached out to me on Twitter, and I'm very glad he did, because it's been a really interesting evening. So I'll be fairly brief. So I think following off my comment in the chat, so I think it's really interesting, these questions about public health approaches, particularly because there's lots of different ways you can do public health. And I think there's a really good point that I think it was Zach that made earlier, that, you know, public health can mean a lot of stuff, and in some ways we'd rather the government maybe takes a more public health approach to public health sometimes, because public health can sometimes Sometimes it involves engaging with communities, building trust, identifying problems upstream. Sometimes it means sort of surveillance, coercion, sort of, taking people and putting them in places, this kind of thing, and the sort of extension of control. And I think one of the things we see is that there is a lot of widespread momentum behind the public health idea, but particularly law enforcement, sometimes to quite a benefit, but sometimes not so much, I've actually taken up this idea of the public health approach to policing, and that's not just the police, but also security services and law enforcement agencies like the National Crime Agency in the UK. And this can mean things like sort of effective community intervention, sort of providing resources to community social welfare, but it can also mean more sort of stigmatizing, centralized top-down campaigns that are based around surveillance, sort of targeting and things like this. So we can see this in things like the UK's Prevent approach to counter-radicalization, which has been extremely controversial, and generally I think a lot of people feel it's been quite a harmful campaign. So my kind of research at the moment that I've been doing has been on some of these public health approaches to policing that police have been developing, and one of them involves the use of, is slightly odd, but the use of targeted adverts. So some of the police use of things like social media and target advertising can be quite positive. So we've seen, I think you mentioned the kind of public health campaign there around male sexual entitlement there, Donna, which is, I think, a good example. Police Scotland are actually really leading kind of community-driven innovation in this field, I think. We also see some policing agencies, particularly, this is not to slag off England, but particularly down south, taking slightly different approaches, which involve a lot of the use of targeted digital adverts. So essentially, profiling communities that it sees as risky or undesirable or a source of crime problems, using various digital mechanisms, including sort of cookies and targeting and various other things like that, to find out what these people are posting online, find out what they're doing online, find out all this stuff about their behavior that's being gathered by the platforms, and then use that essentially to profile them and target them with like behavior change adverts while they're on the toilet, while they're at home listening to music, while they're going out and about, with this idea that they can kind of basically nudge or brainwash people into not committing crime. And a lot of these adverts can be quite stigmatizing and unpleasant, and kind of play into stereotypes, play into kind of things like that. So we've seen particularly the UK Home Office have done some not particularly good stuff around potential refugees and things like that, targeting them with quite stigmatizing adverts. Yes, the fried chicken box is a classic IRL version. So this is where the Home Office, as a part of an anti-knife crime preventative campaign, targeted anti-knife crime ads on boxes of fried chicken in restaurants in order to, the sort of racist underpinning of this was a way of targeting the Black community in London. Obviously, there was a huge outcry about this. The problem is this is now moving online. And well, if we're out and about, we can see these kind of physical ads. The Go Home vans are another example. But online, we actually can't see what other people are being targeted with. We can't see what communities who maybe don't have access to media, maybe don't have access to kind of the same ways of raising alarm. And a lot of this stuff is going on behind the scenes, basically. So I'll stop speaking now. You'd probably be quite relieved. But yeah, so I just kind of wanted to mention a bit of that research and talk about the kind of how some of these preventative approaches can be really good, but some of them could also become excuses to extend more coercive control, a sort of soft net of power throughout communities as well. So we need to be quite careful. And I completely agree. The answer is the community. I mean, it's putting the community first, putting them in the driving seat throughout the process, right from the very start all the way through. But yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I think it's a really important sort of addition to the conversation to understand some of where this is going next, and how the sort of how the framework of fear, how architecture of anxiety can kind of manifest in different places, and I'm sure Donna would resonate strongly with the kind of the danger of the kind of the perceived need for a centralized response, and the attraction of digital as a way to do that. I think is very interesting. I'm conscious of time. We've got about sort of 15 minutes or so left, and I'm very keen to hear from anyone who'd like to chip in, who hasn't spoken yet but would like to reflect. I've seen Harriet posting in the chat. Harriet, if you'd like to contribute, you're more than welcome. I won't sort of force you, but if there are reflections, and then there's also a kind of I guess as the last part of the conversation we were thinking was heading towards, so where next? And I don't necessarily think there's a kind of a group here that's going to sort of decide to do an initiative. We might. I think there's already been some, so I can see in the chat some great connections, and even the connection between Zach and the Young Foundation is already a powerful one, I hope. But Neil sort of hyped up. So, but if I'd love any reflections, particularly on kind of where might this go next? What are what might be done? What might people in this sort of virtual room want to do? So I invite that and kind of hold the space. And anyone who'd like to unmute, both Zach, Emily, Neil, Donna, but anyone else as well. Just like as we turn towards where might this go next? Any reflections or thoughts? That would be wonderful. If that makes sense. Go on, Neil. You're on mute, my friend.
My normal response is to try and shout, but that doesn't seem to work. Yeah, I think we need to do this kind of work everywhere. I think we have foundations, and I think we've got foundations because normally when I talk to people around when was the last time you really felt a sense of community, up here they'll say the last time it snowed. I think COVID is that new moment in terms of people reaching out and helping their neighbours. We've built thousands of tiny bridges between each other through small physical acts of care. And I wonder if we can look back on that and say, okay, so if that was special, how do we then create those bridges with different communities? I think people sometimes are worried about leaning into difficult debates or areas where there's destructive conflict. I don't think conflict is either inherently destructive or inherently positive. I think it's the process that you use that enables that energy to be either positively used or destructively used. So I think there are ways, and I think we can look back on what's been important through really difficult times, and we can see things drifting apart. And we've got a moment now to say, let's pull it back together and try and rebuild something that we really want.
Thanks, Neil. I'm going to frame the question slightly differently and put it to Zach then. What's next for you, Zach? What's live for you? Help us understand sort of what you're looking at from here.
Sure, I appreciate it. One of the things that we're currently working on is to move forward a zero youth incarceration agenda in Alameda County. So we worked over the span of a decade on a campaign to close the state-run youth prisons here in California. Young people were being isolated for weeks and months on end, and in cells. They were 250 miles on average away from their families. And unsurprisingly, 3 out of 4 young people were being rearrested after coming out of these horrible institutions that were basically preparing them for adult prison. So we were successful over a decade-long campaign in closing 5 of 8 youth prisons. And the governor in 2020 signed legislation to phase out of the last 3 state-run youth prisons. Now, this means that resources are now coming back to the local level. And we don't want those local counties to basically repeat the same mistakes as the state. And so one of the things that we're working on is building infrastructure like Restore Oakland, but showing also other amazing community-based initiatives that should be supported so that we can move to a framework where we aren't incarcerating young people. And that's going to take all the kinds of organizing and advocacy and that I've described, but it's also going to take everyday people really standing up for a different paradigm. And so the thing I'll end on is an invitation to you all. Each Tuesday, the first Tuesday in August, we do something called Night Out for Safety and Liberation. And we've done that every year since the murder of Trayvon Martin by a so-called neighborhood watch captain called George Zimmerman. And we think it was the sort of epitome of this kind of framework of fear that this, white man was following a young Black kid through a neighborhood that he didn't believe he belonged in, even though Trayvon was visiting his own family. And that really sparked for us an intention to kind of reclaim through a public event our vision of community safety that is more holistic, that is not based on suspicion and fear. And just this past year, we had nearly 50 cities across the United States participate. It's grown from just a handful of cities when we first started it, and would love to, see people engage, and even if just on social media around that event, in terms of really reclaiming this kind of broader vision of what care means to building out a real safety infrastructure, and as we've talked about, more than safety infrastructure.
Let's try and take the Night Out for Safety and Liberation International. There's a challenge. Emily, I'm going to come to you, and just and Donna, if you'd like to chip in. But like, what's next for the Young Foundation, for the Institute for Community Studies? Sorry, where are you going from here?
So of course our primary focus at the ICS is about that collaborative community research approaches, and so what we're currently in the process of looking to do is to refresh our communities agenda process. So obviously COVID has changed, and Neil touched on this quite a few, most strongly the sense of community and how people sort of feel they can connect, and also as Donna touched on, it's really shifting people's notions of what community power is, and how they can connect at local level. And so we want to go back out to engage, to really kind of see if there are areas of this agenda that need to be reset. I have a hypothesis that safety will still be extremely high on the agenda, but what we will be really seeking to do, because another part of our work is looking at what works, and learning from international models like ZAC's, like a lot of places around the world, and really convening that evidence and asking people running local government, running frontline services, running civil society organizations, kind of what do you need, what access to agile, supportive case studies, evidence and practice do you need to really put some of these community-led and community-powered initiatives in place. So we'll be rerunning the agenda to understand kind of what are the key questions people have on safety now as we are moving into, I'm not going to say post-pandemic, I don't think we are post-pandemic, but as we're moving into a stage of needing to rebuild and renew with communities, and then we'll also be looking at what's the evidence around the questions that communities most want answered in terms of the realm of safety, and we'll definitely be taking some of this practice also into the other work that the Young Foundation does, which is directly doing community building and community development work with some of the poorest communities in the UK, but also in the way that we think about social investment and catalytic capital into community-led ideas and initiatives, which is another key part of the Young Foundation's portfolio. But this has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for contributing so generously, and we really hope that you've made good connections and that you will stay in touch with each other to take some of this work and this kind of movement forward.
And Donna, I'll come to you as well. A new local, what next for you? Are you guys in this space? Is safety going to be a thing for you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're trying to influence government, but to be honest, I think it's the structure of the state, of the British state, is incapable of doing this because of the kind of centralised, fragmented way that it operates. So I think we're trying to support local systems to do it, and all it takes is a few committed individuals like Zach, and other people that are really passionate about this and want to just get on with it. So we've got 72 places that are trying to do this we've got some in Scotland, we've got some in Wales. So I think trying to support those willing people who want to make it happen on the ground. We can't wait another 5 years, can we, till the next election or whatever. We've just got to get on with it. I don't think this is something that the state can gift to communities. Communities have got to do it, and we've got to support them in doing it.
Lovely words, thank you, Donna, and very sort of powerful words to avoid Kevin, as Kevin said, the phrase empowering words. Very powerful words. Like this is something that can be led from the ground up. I genuinely love the idea of the Night Out of Safety and Liberation migrating across the Atlantic. So there may be a bit of organising and connecting we can do on that front that I can help with as well. But this has been such a rich conversation. I hope everyone's enjoyed it at least close to as much as I have. The last thing I want to let you know is that we are lucky enough to have have some copies of Zach's book that he's generously given us. So there will be copies of the book at the Young Foundation in London. If anyone would like to sort of get hold of one and can get there. If not, then I'm sure if you can't get there, and you can drop me or them a note, I'm sure we can figure out a way to get you a copy. But I guess all that remains for me to say, unless anyone's going to wave frantically at me that I've forgotten something hugely important, is to say thank you hugely to all of you for coming, and particularly to sort of offer thanks to Donna and Emily for their insights, and of course hugely to Zach for your time.
And thank you, John. I think you're understating your role in actually providing those books and making sure that there were books available. So just want to appreciate you bringing us together.
Thanks all. Thank you, Zach. Good night.